What is that? Why are you wearing gloves? Okay. You have to fill that out. You have to fill it out and give it back to me. Well, you didn't give it back to me, so I thought you lost it, so I gave you another one.
I'm more responsible.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, it was due yesterday.
Oh.
Yeah.
What was your show?
So, Tony, could you get that signed and
Evan, what do you do? Return the thing, please.
turn back?
Wait, what's due today? It's like an art.
The waiver for the glass blowing.
They are.
Oh, true. That is so small.
All right. So, one thing that I did want to bring up, I love it when news.
Oh, Natalia, you're so close.
When we get news that matches what we've already been talking about.
Art news.
Art news, of course it is.
I thought you were talking about like getting three.
So, renowned Egyptian archaeologist calls for the return of the Rosetta Stone. So we talked about the Rosetta Stone, right? And how it's a hugely important, not only work of art, but work of culture. This is how.
3 different languages.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is how we were able to figure out, what hieroglyphics look like and such. But it's interesting. I just wanted to take a minute to talk about this. I don't know if you can read it very well. But he's talking about how this archaeologist is telling the British Museum, hey, you should return this. This is a piece of our culture. All right, so where did the Rosetta Stone come from? We talked about this briefly. The French were in Egypt. They had conquered Egypt during the time of Napoleon, right? And they found this stone, and they took it. And later on, shortly afterwards, there was the famous Battle of Waterloo, right? The British defeated Napoleon. That kind of ended the Napoleonic Empire, and the British became now the de facto rulers of the empire, we'd call it, right? During the 1800s, the British were the ones who had the biggest empire. The Rosetta Stone, so it was acquired by the British Museum in 1802 from France under a treaty signed during the Napoleonic Wars. So a lot of the stuff that Napoleon had gathered went to Britain now. So now Britain owns it, and it's part of the British Museum. But this was Egyptian. It was stolen from them by the French. So what do you guys think? Should it stay in the British Museum? Should it go back to Egypt? Who owns it? Who owns this work of art? Egyptians. I'm kind of on that side as well. This is definitely a piece of their heritage. It's funny, if you go into the British Museum and you look at I've never been, but I was just listening to a podcast about this yesterday, and the host was talking about, if you go into the British Museum and you look at the Rosetta Stone, and you turn around and you walk about 25 feet that way, I don't know if this is true or not, but I presume so, you see statues that were taken from the top of the Parthenon. And these are called the Elgin marbles. There was a British explorer, his name was Elgin, and he went and he basically took statues from the Parthenon and brought them back to Britain. Greece wants those back too. I think they have a claim on that. I think that's right. Right? It gets complicated though when you have these colonial aspects of things, right? If areas of the world are under British control or English control or American control, then they do belong to that conquering power. So let me put it this way. So for a while, let's look at maybe a not perfect example, but the United States owns Hawaii. It didn't always own Hawaii. It wasn't always part of the United States, right? It was its own island. I'm sure in museums on the mainland of the United States there are Hawaiian artifacts. Should we return those, right? So it gets more complicated if you get into different details, but I just wanted to bring this up. This is part of a much larger movement, and we're going to be talking about this a few more times. This is called repatriation, right? Repatriate, right? Take it back to your country. It's an interesting debate, but then do we go into things like, well, every work of art should be returned to its country of origin? Should all of the Van Goghs be brought back to the Netherlands, right?
It's just ridiculous.
So we'll talk a lot more about that, right? There are definitely times when it's perfectly fine, right? When the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City buys works of art from other places, okay, fine. They own that now. That's theirs. They shouldn't have to return that. But if it was taken when a country was under conquest, it makes it a little more interesting. Anyway, I just want to bring that to your attention since we just talked about it. There's also a claim to be made that actually, since the Rosetta Stone was made during the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, which we'll talk about, that the Rosetta Stone actually belongs to the Greeks, not to the Egyptians, because the Greeks owned Egypt at the time that this stone was carved. So should it go back to Greece? Anyway, it gets complicated. There's a lot to, yeah, yep. Okay, so we're looking at the last part of ancient Egypt.
No,
Yes.
worry, no, for how long the British Museum has been open, why are they now asking for it back?
This is just a larger, bigger movement. It's political pressure. It's just, this is part of a larger movement. It all started with these, this broader movement started with these bronzes, these bronze statues that were called the Benin bronzes. Same sort of thing happened. They were taken by the British from this country in Africa, Benin, and they were just taken to the British Museum. And that's, that's been going on for about 15, 20 years, where this country of Africa says, this is our heritage, we want it back. You took it. You didn't buy it. We didn't give it to you. It wasn't part of a treaty. You just came in, you conquered our land, and you took it. We want it back. And this is all part of that broader movement. It's just gaining traction like anything else. All right, so after the middle period, we have the third intermediate period. And this was, remember we said the Hyksos came in, and all these other people came in from all throughout. There was a prince called Ahmose the First, who basically drove all of these people out of Egypt. And this is essentially ushering in the period of the New Kingdom. This is probably the most recognizable period. Other than the pyramids, this is what we know the most about, and this is where we have the most variation in art in Egypt that we've seen. The first thing to look at, the first person to look at, was a queen, and this is the first queen that we have of Egypt. Her name was Hatshepsut. Again, in the Middle Kingdom, we had these artistic representations that were a little bit different. Things were starting to change. Things were starting to evolve a little bit. And then we have this pullback. You're going to see that all the time in art history. Seniors, you've seen this before. There's always this period of revolution. There's always this period of innovation. And then there's a pullback, right? And then we go back, and then we go back. Same thing is happening here with Egypt. So we have this return back to these original older standards of artistic representations. This is Hatshepsut. She reigned from 1479 to 1458, so a decent period of time, and she was very powerful. She is depicted pretty realistically, but there's a couple things that are interesting. The depiction is a little bit more realistic. It's realistic, but it still has those same standards, right? So she doesn't have any facial characteristics that are strikingly different from anyone else. She was the first female ruler of ancient Egypt to reign as a male with the full authority of the pharaoh. She is often depicted with a beard. And in fact, she would wear a prosthetic, a fake beard made out of wood. It would be, and sometimes during larger ceremonial events, it would be even encrusted with jewels or something. Obviously, she couldn't grow a beard, so she would put one on, and it would just be tied on with string, kind of like a Halloween costume. But she's often depicted with a beard. That's Hatshepsut, even though it has a beard. She chose to be depicted as a male pharaoh in statuary and reliefs. even though she referred to herself as female. So she definitely wanted to, again, harken back to the original male pharaohs. This is similar to the tomb that we saw in the Middle Kingdom. This is the tomb of Hatshepsut. It's somewhat nearby where we were looking before, but this is one of the most complex tombs that we have in ancient Egypt. Yeah.
Do you have any idea how she was able to become queen and not have a pharaoh on the side of her?
I don't know that. Sorry.
So she didn't build the pyramid like the others.
Nope, she didn't. But she did build this tomb/temple complex. Remember we talked about last time how there was this new idea of building a tomb with a temple. She did that same thing. This is called the Temple of Dir al-Bahri.
Is that actually a picture or is that a cartoon?
No, that's an actual picture. It's still fairly well preserved. They've done some renovations to it. It looked a lot different, or not a lot different. It looked a little bit different. It's still one of the most visited. It's still one of the most impressive ones in Egypt. It's decorated with statuary, reliefs, and inscriptions, with her burial chamber carved out of the cliffs which form the back of the building. So just like what we saw before, this temple was built into the cliff, and then the burial chamber, it's going to go way back down in here.
Oh, wow.
Okay, just like we saw before. And this was a huge whole temple complex. This was all part of this temple complex as well.
Did that have more of a roof area, or was it actually built like?
No, these would be like courtyards, similar to how you see it today. One thing that we see that is very interesting is for the first time we see columns carved out in the shape of people. These are called Atlantid columns. And that's a term that the Greeks gave it, Atlantid, roughly coming from the root of being man, right? So Atlas columns, Atlantid columns. Yeah, do you have a question?
Would these, would they be done, like these big temples and stuff, by the time the pharaoh was dead? Or would they
Most
be
of the
done
time.
A lot after.
Most of the time. As soon as the pharaoh ascends the throne, they get started. They get started on their project. Yep. Because again, this was super important to them. You have to have a good burial place and you have to have it done right so that you can have a good afterlife. So this was a priority. Yeah.
How long did it take to build it? She reigned for a decent amount of time, not that long. That's huge.
If you consider that the pyramids were built in a span of about 20 years, this is not going to be that long. It's probably 3 to 5 years would be my guess. Yeah, again, it's going to be different depending, but
So the necropolis, that's what that thing is called, like her temple burial thing.
it's called a necropolis. So a necropolis, strictly speaking, is just the burial thing,
Okay.
but it's a necropolis temple complex. You can refer to it as either. When the Greeks came in, towards the end of the Old Kingdom, or the end of the New Kingdom, they really liked this idea of building columns out of people. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. We can see that that the Greeks did the same thing. So that's a direct correlation from Egypt. So the Greeks are going to do something a little bit different, but that's a direct influence from Egypt.
Really?
Their carving is so much
Yep.
more like
Refined.
yeah.
Yeah, it is.
More like realistic.
Yep. So if you remember, there's Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. This is where a lot of the Old Kingdom pharaohs were. This is where the Pyramids of Giza is, right outside of Cairo. But during the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, most of the action, most of the temples and the centers of power are going to be here. This is right near Thebes. And where Hatshepsut built her temple complex and her necropolis, it was called the Valley of the Kings. Pharaohs who came after her so admired what she had done, and also they really liked the fact that it was in this rocky valley, that it was difficult to get into, that they started getting buried there too. It became basically a pharaoh graveyard. So this gray is basically where the valley is, the white is where the mountains are. And these are all the different tombs of pharaohs and princes and rulers that we have, basically starting with
What are the squares?
that's the size of the temple or the
Not
burial.
rectangle, the small squares.
So I tried to look that up. I couldn't find information from this exact map. They may be unknown people or they may be princes. I'm not 100% certain, but they are burial spots.
Where are hers from?
I don't know. Why do you ask hard questions?
I think she's
I
Right
promise.
next to Ray-
I promise I do know about art. Egypt is just not the area that I know a lot about. I'm sorry.
Tutankhamun.
So yeah, we'll talk about Tutankhamun here.
Tut.
Okay.
Wait, I don't understand how she's a pharaoh. Like, she's depicted as a pharaoh.
Let me get back to you on that. I'll find out.
We'll get back to that.
We'll get back to that. We'll put a pin in that.
Next!
Does someone else have a question?
I think she does.
Okay.
Turn blades
Yes,
The Hatshepsut, again, even though she only reigned for about 29 years, 27 years, she built on a much grander scale than any other pharaoh in the New Kingdom. Ramses II did build quite a bit. Ignore that. That was Evan.
I love Ramses.
But we'll get to him. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about temple complexes. Temple complexes were not just burial sites as well. There were these temple complexes, right? Just like we have churches today, they have temple complexes or temples, right? This is Luxor. This is probably the most famous of the temples, and yes, that's where the Vegas thing gets its name, Luxor.
It looks like Vegas.
It does kind of, the colors do.
So this is what it looks like today. It has been renovated a little bit, and obviously, the lights make it pretty cool. So Temple of Luxor, it was situated on the east bank of the River Nile in the town of Luxor, right nearby, right near where we were talking about, right near Thebes, right near the Valley of the Kings. It was dedicated to Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, and it was the focus of one of the most important religious festivals in ancient Egypt, the Opet festival. So you can see here kind of how it was arranged, right? So we have all of these different courtyards, and you can see the Sphinx Professional of Nectanebo, statue of Ramses II, courtyard of Amenhotep, right? So these were all being built in different stages. So it wasn't just built by one pharaoh. Each pharaoh wanted to add on to it.
Don't they have like the pool thing? That's just decoration.
Just to cool it off with the trees, I think.
I think it's to cool it off.
That's what the Romans did
Mhm.
in their houses.
That would be my
So
guess.
They take that water from there.
No,
Pro-
it would just like fan out. That's
So
what the
the-
Romans did. It was like a.
It was like an aqueduct.
The Temple of
No, how do they
Luxor.
get
It would be a little canal or a little, maybe just
Oh,
people just pulling it in.
So the Temple of Luxor didn't have anybody buried in it, did it?
No, it didn't. It didn't. It was purely for religious and ceremonial reasons.
Who started it first?
Not 100% sure.
Ramses.
No, Ramses was way towards the end.
I just like that.
But there's a bunch of
Ramses.
There's a bunch of Ramses.
So cool.
There were three.
Moses Ramses.
But why is there Ramses?
Moses, Ramses, Moses. Sorry. Did you ever see the movie? Yeah, okay, okay.
We
Okay.
should watch it.
You know what? Yeah.
Um,
David, we get back tomorrow.
During this festival, the statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu would travel from Karnak to Luxor. So they would do like this procession. And so there were these two temples. There was the Temple of Karnak and there was the Temple of Luxor. And they were pretty close by. It was 5 or 10 miles away from each other, I think. Most of the temples were situated directly, like facing the Nile, right? There was religious significance to the Nile because there was practical significance to the Nile. And so this became religious significance. There were festivals all the time when the Nile would flood or when the Nile would recede. There would be all these sorts of festivals. Just kind of like how we have today, right? As Catholics, we have rogation days during the changing of the seasons. Same sort of thing. But this Temple of Luxor was not aligned to the Nile. Most of the time, the temple would be facing the Nile, perpendicular to the Nile exactly. But this one is almost parallel to it. In fact, it's a little bit off kilter. The reason why is because this section here would face exactly the Temple of Karnak. So during some part of the year, these statues would be in Karnak. During other parts of the year, they would be in Luxor, and they would travel back and forth. So there was this connection between the two temples.
Which part is the line?
The darker brown part.
Oh. So it faces it.
Mm-hmm. So the darker brown part is the older part, and then you can see how things were added on a little bit later on.
Okay.
Here's another temple. This is not Luxor. This is another temple. Just showing how it was built. And then later on, we have Muslims come in and they basically sanctify the Egyptian temple by turning it into a mosque. And so these towers here, these were later added on by Muslims. But we see the same sort of plan, this same sort of temple plan. You have an obelisk here, you have a great entrance, you have this hall kind of similar to how a Catholic church is, right? You have this grand entrance, then you have this long hall, you have these pillars. It's very, very similar. Yeah.
Why is it a mosque?
When the Muslims came in about 1,500 years later, they turned it into a mosque.
Why would they do that?
It's got church.
It's already pre-made. You don't have to build anything from scratch.
So it says that Luxor was dedicated to Amunat and
Kansu, yeah.
Kansu, but then it also says dedicated to the royal Ka. What is
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so during this period, so good segue, because that's what we're going to talk about next.
Oh, sorry.
During this, no, it's fine. During this period, you've always had this correlation with the pharaoh being somewhat godlike, somewhat divine, right? While they're alive, they are almost acting on behalf of the gods. So if you want to think of an analogy, a weak analogy, but sort of an analogy would be how the Pope acts in stand of Christ on earth. So the pharaoh is not God himself, but he is acting in the stead of gods. But then once he dies, then he becomes a god. Towards the New Kingdom, we have this blurring of lines, where the pharaohs start to depict themselves more and more as gods on earth. And so the temple was not just, this temple of Luxor was not just a temple for Amun and Mut and Kansu. It was at the beginning, but as time progresses, it becomes a temple to the Ka, to the spirit of the pharaoh who is godlike. And so they would make sacrifices and they would do these ceremonies for the spirit of the pharaoh who is actually living.
Oh,
Not exactly worshiping him, but worshiping his
soul?
deity, right, his soul.
Okay.
Again, I'm sketchy on the details, but that's what I understand. Sorry. Throughout these temple complexes, we see these massive statues. On either side of this temple, we have Amenhotep on one side, Ramses II on the other side, and then we have this other development. This is called relief carving. We've talked about relief carving a little bit.
That is so cool.
These pillars are going to carry messages, and again, it's going to have religious significance to the gods that they are praying to, that they are sacrificing to, etc. So each of these columns have some sort of carving in them. And again, this is an innovation of the New Kingdom. You build it just flat, and then you go in and you just start carving in.
No, you would like, how do you round them?
Just lots of chisels.
Sanding.
Chisels.
Lots of chisels.
I don't know, I just.
So we have seen,
It took a long time.
Forever.
and these were all painted too, by the way. The paint has all worn away, but this was all painted. You can see just little bits of pigment still left.
Was that the same on how do you say the name?
Hatshepsut?
Yeah, like those statues, like you can see like red.
Mhm.
cheeks and stuff.
Yep.
Oh, that's cool.
We love that
Seniors, you know this term, fresco secco.
Yeah.
So what is fresco secco, seniors?
These are like the plaster with the paint on it.
Yeah, plaster with paint on it. So you do the plaster, you let the plaster dry, and then you do paint on it. And that's how the walls were painted. So it was always plaster. Whenever they tried to paint on stone, it would just flake off immediately. That's why we just don't have a lot of stone things that have
Plaster with paint?
plaster with paint. That's what fresco secco means, dry fresco. The painting was much more natural, but it's still very stylized. Meaning, you can see the birds, you can see the feathers, you can see the fish, the Nile. Everything around it looks very realistic. And this is a development of the New Kingdom. Things look much more natural and realistic, except for the people. The people still have that same convention. Okay? We've talked about this a little bit, and seniors, we've definitely talked about this too, but there's this idea of natural versus stylized. Right? What does stylized mean?
It's got a certain style to it where you can't style it.
It's not like I'm going to style it a certain way. It's not that. In art history, we talk about stylization as what? Okay, so the recent portraits of President Obama were just released yesterday, right? So every president has a portrait that is done. It's usually released after his presidency. If we had a portrait of President Obama, and he was wearing like a wife beater tank top and shorts and standing in front of a Camaro, let's say that that was the painting and it looked very realistic. We would say that's realistic, but it's not stylized, meaning it doesn't fit the conventions of who he is as a president. Okay?
That makes sense.
So we can say this is stylized. It fits these conventions, these preconceived conventions. They're going to ignore some realism in favor of stylization. And we're going to be talking more about stylization as we go, so don't worry too much about those distinctions right now.
Do we have any idea why they would do that? Why they would draw the people realistically?
It would, I think it goes back to this whole idea of don't change depictions of the pharaoh because they are godlike. We don't want to mess with that. There's another ruler, Amenhotep III. He built so many monuments and temples that scholars said, well, he must have had a very long reign. He didn't. What's that?
No.
He didn't do a lot, or he didn't reign for a very long time, but he did so many things that scholars think he reigned for a long time. These are called the Colossi of Memnon. These are these massive statues. I thought I had a different one in here.
The little lady next to him.
Yeah.
Where? Go ahead.
These are really, really large statues.
Next to the
I
stick.
had a different picture of them somewhere.
That guy's got to
Oh,
Well,
I see it.
I didn't put it in.
Lady.
Oh,
The
there.
left next to
It's
the
not a
snake.
real lady, it's a statue.
Oh.
Oh.
It's just a statue, right?
But these are huge, right? These are called the Colossi, and they've just deteriorated because of this, of the weather, because of the sand, etc. All right, Amenhotep, very, very powerful. These stood at the entrance to his mortuary temple, which is now gone. I don't know why it's gone. Maybe it was raided. Maybe they took stones from another place. I don't know. But Amenhotep was very powerful. He had a son, and this is where things start to get kind of crazy. He had a son whose name was Akhenaten. When he was born, his name was Amenhotep IV, right? So Amenhotep III, Amenhotep IV. But when he came to the throne, he totally transformed the way that Egypt saw its pharaohs, its gods, and basically everything about its religion. He moved the capital from Thebes, which is right now down here, to Amarna, a town of not very much significance before his time. He decided also, instead of focusing on all of these different gods, he decided to focus on one god, Aten. And what made it worse for the priests and the people is that Aten wasn't a real god in their mind. Aten was this combination of two gods, Amun and Ra. So Ra being the sun god and Amun being, another deity. And he combined them and basically said, I am this god. I am. So now we have this full shift all the way into a pharaoh saying, I don't just represent God, I am God. And you will worship me as a god. Right? Not very well. Not very well. No one liked it, but what are you going to do? You can't really do anything against the pharaoh. His wife was named Nefertiti. This is one of the most beautiful pieces of artwork done in Egyptian history. Okay, we don't have a lot of time to go through that video, but you get the gist of it. He's totally transforming everything. The priests are very powerful people. They have a lot of hold over the people, and the people don't like their religion being changed. I mean, we know how that goes, right? So that was a big problem. But again, there's not a lot they could do with it. Along with this idea of changing the theology of Egypt, the artistic convention started to change as well. And overnight and radically and drastically.
Is this a tradition like everything to them?
But how come that started changing as well?
He wanted to depict himself realistically. Instead of following these conventions, instead of being stylized according to the ways of all of his predecessors, he wanted to do this massive break with tradition, and he wanted to depict himself radically differently. So you see him depicted in this long, elongated, almost alien-like style. This is one of the reasons why there's these theories out there that aliens built the pyramids and all that stuff, because he looks really alien-like. The problem is that he's like 1,500 years removed from the pyramids, but whatever. But you see, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, the sun, all, he's the one who has the power of the sun, but then and his children as well. And these conventions are totally different. Max, I think you go first.
How in their video it showed the guy finding like Egyptian artifact just randomly. How do they know where to look?
So they get kind of these clues from, it must be in the Valley of the Kings. Maybe it's here, and they just start digging and start going around. Yeah.
Is so, because he wanted things to be more like realistically portrayed, is that why that one bust of Nefertiti looks so realistic?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's very realistic. We think that that's exactly what she looked like. The depictions of him are wild. Maybe he did look like this. We don't know. But
Scary.
he must have had some sort of, much more of a long face. We don't know. Also, he didn't last very long. Just like a lot of other royal families throughout history, there was a lot of inbreeding. There was a lot of brothers marrying sisters, etc., to try to keep that royal bloodline. So maybe he did look a little weird because of that, right? And again, here's another depiction of the bust of Nefertiti. By the way, also in the British Museum, Egypt also wants it back.
So
Okay.
was she a relative of her husband? Was she
She was. She wasn't his sister, but I think she was a cousin or something like that.
The British Museum has a ton of Egyptian artifacts, and Egypt wants them back.
Mm-hmm.
That's just like
Mm-hmm.
did they like have very good like makeup and like stuff like
Have you
that?
seen it?
They did.
Have you gone?
Not here. They did. They used quite a bit of makeup.
Like would they like put
Eyeshadow
Isn't
and
it
black.
like
Yep, all that stuff.
Iron or something?
Yeah,
Like-
it was all lots of pigments.
Yeah.
All right. So what happens when you have a king, when you have a ruler who was seen as a disaster? Right after Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten, whatever you want to call him. Right afterwards, we have his son, whose name was Tutankhamun. He was a boy pharaoh. His dad died young. He gained the throne very, very young. He was forced to marry his sister Kai, who was basically a regent. She was an older sister, so he was basically under her control. He's not important. Tutankhamun is not important, but he's the most famous of the pharaohs. Why?
Because he's so
Because we know about him. Most of the other graves, most of the other tombs were robbed. Again, over a very long period of time, these graves are robbed. All of these scrolls, all of this information that we have is lost about a lot of these pharaohs. The only information we have is literally what's carved into stone. There were no tombs that were found intact throughout the entire Valley of the Kings and throughout all of the pyramids. There were none that were found intact. Maybe I shouldn't say none, but probably none. Someone is probably going to say, well, there was that. I don't know. But
Is this in the British Museum as well?
some of it is. There was an explorer in the early 1900s who went to try to find.
Tutankhamun is in modern
This
times
tomb.
the most famous of the
He
pharaohs.
had heard rumors
the only
that there
one
was
to
this
have a
tomb that had been
nickname in popular
undisturbed.
culture, King Tut.
And so he went to try to find this. His name was Howard
The
Carter.
1922 discovery by Howard Carter of Tutankhamun's near intact tomb received worldwide press coverage and sparked a renewed public interest in ancient Egypt, of which Tutankhamun remains the popular face. Tutankhamun was born about 1343 BC and came to the throne of Egypt at age 9 or 10. He died at about age 19 under circumstances that have left archaeologists baffled. For many years, rumours of a curse, probably fueled by newspapers at the time of the discovery, persisted, emphasising the early death of some of those who had first entered the tomb. Lord Carnarvon did die unexpectedly in 1923, shortly after the discovery of the tomb, leading to speculation that there was a curse on those who disturbed the resting place of the pharaoh. However, a recent study indicates no statistical difference between the age of death of those who entered the tomb and those who did not. Most lived past 70.
Okay. So we have this explorer. His name was Howard Carter. And he was financed by a British lord named Lord Carnarvon. And Carter had been working in Egypt for years, going through all these tombs that had been gone through many times before, not really discovering anything new. And he hears rumors from local Egyptians who were there, who he had employed to help him do the work and do the digging, etc., that there was this other tomb, that maybe there was this other tomb. And so he went to this place and they started digging. The tomb had been totally covered over by a landslide, so it was effectively hidden. We didn't even know anything about this king named Tutankhamun. We had no idea. He wasn't in any other records. We'll talk about that why in a second. And so he starts digging, and he goes down and he finds this doorway, and it still has the seal. It still has the royal seal of the pharaohs on it. So we have this doorway, and there's this bar in the middle. It's wrapped with rope, and then it's sealed with a wax seal that's still intact. And so he immediately telegrams back to Britain, Lord Carnarvon, come quick, you got to come, because he's not going to go in without his sponsor. Howard Carter goes in, and he starts to crawl through, and with a torch he yells back, I see things. I see wonderful things. This was a huge discovery because we've never been into a tomb that still has all of these artifacts in it. And so he finds this sarcophagus, or this exterior coffin with this sarcophagus inside, and this has become probably the most famous of all the Egyptian artifacts. Again, Tutankhamun was not important. He's only important to us because we are able to learn so much about Egyptian culture from this tomb.
So his body was in there.
Uh-huh. Yep, that's how they were able to depict his face. We have his mummy, his corpse. This is a recreation in a museum of what it looked like. The inside was almost kind of jammed full. It looks like a storage unit of all of this stuff, all of these amazing things. Here's a picture of what it looked like when he went in. There were chariots for hunting, extra wheels in case maybe a wheel went off. I don't know. All of these couches, these cushions, Ka statues are inside here. And it's filled with all these sorts of jewels. We have what's called the antechamber with all of the stuff in it. His actual burial chamber with 4 sarcophagus. And then the treasury, all of his finest things in it.
Did those sarcophagus die? Did they take up the entire room?
Just about. Yep. There was probably just a little bit of space between. This is a smaller tomb. If you look at some of the other tombs that are there, that are empty now, this is smaller. Again, he didn't reign very long. He didn't have a very important reign at all in the history of Egypt. He didn't have a lot of treasure, but this gives you an idea of what those other tombs must have been like.
And how did we learn so much about him if we had no idea who he was before?
Because we have his tomb.
But
We have all of these artifacts in there. And these records are in there. Everything about his reign is in here.
That's so weird.
to depict his name then too.
Is he
Yeah.
one of the latest kings too?
One of the later ones, yeah.
Later kings?
That's so weird to think
Okay.
that nobody knows this
Yeah.
back then. All of it.
So why don't we know about these guys? We didn't know very much about Akhenaten either. In fact, later on, pharaohs following Tutankhamun completely erased Akhenaten from history. They scraped his name off the walls. They destroyed statues of his, as many as they could find. We still have a few. And they even destroyed the name of Tutankhamun. They scraped it away. Why? Because he was a bad pharaoh, because he totally revolutionized. And the priests, later on, once the capital moved back to Thebes, they told the pharaohs, you got to get rid of this, you got to get rid of this. You cannot let this monotheism come back. This is going to, and they phrased it as theology, but it was really about power. Let's get rid of this. We can't have it anymore. But we know a lot about it because of this discovery. So Horemheb, he was the pharaoh directly after Tutankhamun, basically whitewashed Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, got rid of him. We don't talk about Bruno. Okay. Just quickly, the fall of Egypt. Ramses II, Ramses the Great. More temples, more obelisks, more children than any other pharaoh. He fought the Hittites, fought to a stalemate. This is what we think Ramses looked like. This is what Ramses looks like today.
Oh my god.
That's Ramses.
He looks that good.
How's it so well preserved?
dry climate and good mummification. They were masters of that.
Wait, where's that at?
This is I think this is in Cairo now. He's in
still
Cairo.
has teeth in his mouth.
Yeah.
That's insane.
His nose is still on.
So he's the one who fought against Moses.
That's crazy.
The one that enslaved all the Israelites.
All the Israelites. Yep, that's him.
What the heck? I cannot believe
It's kind of crazy to see his face, right?
Yeah.
He's the one.
How does he still have hair on?
Very good mummification. And it's a dry climate too. If he was buried in in Florida or London, wouldn't have it.
Or
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
that's creepy.
Yeah.
That's
Is there
creepy
any of the
crazy.
rest of his body?
Yeah, his whole body's there.
Just cut off the-
So he was a very strong ruler. He was a very good ruler for the Egyptians. But shortly after his reign, we have this great period of instability. All these different claims to the throne. There were priests in the Amun cult. There were foreign invaders. All this stuff was happening. By 945, we have the Libyans who are over here. They come in and invade. And again, other cultures are starting to advance by this time. They start to have navies. They start to have power. They start to have money. For a while, Egypt was the power on earth. You don't mess with Egypt, right? It's kind of like the United States today with 6 aircraft carriers. You don't mess with the United States, right? Same sort of thing was happening with Egypt. You don't mess with them. But other kingdoms start to get more advanced. They start to invade. So we have all of these invasions coming in. The Libyan influence, 945. We have the Assyrians in 670. They totally conquered Egypt in 670. They kind of colonized it, though, left it under direct control. And then from 670 to 332, we have the Egyptians starting to get more cozy with the Greeks, who are starting to gain power. Greece is right over here, starting to get more cozy with the Greeks, right? The Greeks are good trading partners. They're gaining an influence. And so the Greeks and the Egyptians kind of start to have this sort of an alliance of sorts, trying to push back the Assyrians. But then they're fully conquered by Alexander the Great in 332. And then it's under Roman control from 30 BC to 641 AD. So Egypt totally falls essentially by about 500 to 600 AD. It's completely gone. This is Cleopatra. You've probably heard about Cleopatra, right?
Cleopatra.
So she was the queen of Egypt at the time, and she made this treaty. She made this marriage with Mark Antony of Rome. This is what we think she looks like. By all accounts, she was a very strong and a very good leader, but there was conflict going on in Rome at the time. Mark Antony was kind of seen as a weak leader. He was overtaken by other people. She had to flee back to Egypt. She was defeated. So this is kind of the fall of Egypt. We think. All right, next class, we're going to go up north a little bit. Yeah.